Hi, Caleb with Brownells here, and today's video is going to be the next part of our bolt action build series. Now this video itself can actually really be a standalone video because we're also going to go over how to properly mount an optic. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go through the optic I chose, the rings I chose, and show you how to put it all together. So let's just start with the base. Depending on what rifle you have or what rifle you're building, you may not have an integral base like this Aero Precision SOLUS action does. So whenever I say integral base, I mean the actual 1913 rail on top is part of the receiver. It's not removable. The majority of your bolt action receivers out there, they'll most likely be drilled and tapped, which means there's holes that are drilled into it and then threaded for a screw, so you can attach bases to it. That's great because there's a lot of different options out there. You can go with your S&K type stuff, your Tally type stuff, your more popular like the Redfield Leopold style bases, which have your turn-in style, and then of course your Weaver style rails, which is like a 1913 light for all intents and purposes, and then of course your 1913 rails, which is in my opinion one of the best or the most versatile, which is why Aero actually added that to this receiver. Alright, so assuming we don't have to add a base to the firearm, which in some cases you will, just follow the instructions for that, no big deal. The base is installed. So next up is going to be choosing a set of rings. This right here, I mean, a lot of this is personal preference on what rings you use. There's a ton of different rings out there. There's a lot of great rings out there. Fortunately, in today's market, as long as you're buying from a reputable company, there are very few bad rings out there, all right? So we're using TPS rings here. It's just a really good, solid quality ring. Nothing too crazy expensive, nothing too cheap either. Just a good in-the-middle ring that's gonna do everything we need it to do. The ones we're using are aluminum. These are also available in steel. We're doing aluminum because this is a nice lightweight setup we have here, and we wanna stay on track of being nice and lightweight. Alright, so those are the rings we're going to be using. The optic is the Nightforce SHV. This one here is a 4-14. And as far as Nightforce optics go, this one is relatively lightweight. They definitely make some that are a little bit heavier and a lot more expensive than this one, but this will do everything we need it to do. So this is the one we're using here. And something to note, the tube, and when I say tube, I mean this area here and this area back here. The tube diameter for this is 30 millimeters. It's important to match the tube diameter to the ring, all right? You can't put 1-inch rings on a 30 millimeter tube, or they have to match. You have to have that exact measurement in order to mount it up. All right, so step one to mounting any optic is going to be to level the rifle. So we're using the real Avid Master Gun Workstation here. If you're not familiar with it, we did a video on it that highlights all the features. Go check that out. The reason I'm using it is because it makes it really easy for mounting optics. The reason it makes it so easy is because it makes leveling the firearm easy, which is a very important step, and I'll explain why later on in the video here. Alright, so this is my 1913 rail on top. I want to level the firearm, so I'm going to use that rail to do that. And I know you can't see the bubble here, but it is off. And there's a few things I can do with this particular base to get it on. Now, there's some adjustment here. If you're using a standard vise, all you would do is just set up the firearm in the vise level and then lock it down. All right. That gets me pretty close, and then on this gun workstation I can actually adjust the feet to fine-tune everything. Alright, so now the firearm here is perfectly level. Alright, so now I'm working with a level firearm. The reason I want the firearm level is because I need the scope level. And the reason I need this scope level is so that my adjustments as far as my vertical and horizontal are true. Because if my scope is canted just a little bit here, my vertical adjustment now becomes a vertical and horizontal adjustment because it's going to be going at an angle rather than true vertical. And I'll explain a little bit more of that later on in this video. But what we need to determine right now is where we want to mount our scope on this rail. We need to make sure we have enough room for our eye relief, right? So what we're going to do, what I typically like to do is come a few inches back from the tang of the receiver, or the tang of the action, which is right here. And that's where I typically like to put my eyepiece, the end of my eyepiece. So I'll just kind of make a visual note here of what slots I'm going to be putting my rings in. Alright. And I'm just going to set my rings in there. And hand tighten them. Alright, so those are nice and snug there. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the tops of the scope rings. And I'm going to, for these rings, your rings may be different depending on, what you're using. I'm going to need a Torx bit. And I'm just going to pull all these screws out here. There's one cap. Alright, and there's the other one. Now I can just lay my scope in. And at this point, if you don't know where your eye relief should be, you can set the scope in the rings carefully, pick up the rifle, or get behind the rifle if you can, and put your head on your cheek piece, and what you should see is a nice round field of view. You shouldn't have to move your head in or out to get that field of view full. So you're going to do that on a low power, then turn your scope up to a higher power and do the exact same thing. Reason is because where your head is on a lower power, your eye relief is going to change if you're on that higher magnification. So put it on that maximum magnification, or the magnification you're going to be shooting at the most, I'll say, and make sure your eye relief is good there. Alright, so I know mine's going to be about right here, so I'm just going to leave it there for this video, and I'm going to go ahead and put my ring tops back on. And what I want to do as I tighten these down, and actually what I'll go ahead and do at this point here is, let me find a good way to show you this. I'll move my coffee so I don't spill it all over the place. So I know you guys don't want to waste time watching me clean up a bunch of coffee. I'm going to turn this kind of this way here so you can see the gap in this scope ring right here, how there's a big gap there. On the other side, there's no gap at all, so if I actually push it down, it'll close that gap. So what I want to do is make sure I create an equal gap on each side. And then I'm going to tighten down these screws so that that gap remains equal. Now, before I start tightening down these screws, something I need to check. I need to make sure that my turret area, so this bevel right here, my eyepiece, and the bell, I want to make sure my rings are not touching any of those. They want to be only contacting the tube, none of those actual angles, okay? So make sure you do that, because if not, you can very well have issues and getting your firearm to group. I don't know the exact scientific reason that causes issues. I know it has something to do with harmonics and science and all that stuff, but just make sure you're mounted on the tube. Alright, so what I'm going to do without a torque wrench is just get these snugged up. And what I like to do is actually open the gap all the way here so that there's no gap on the opposite side. There's a big gap on this side that you can see. And I will just start tightening this screw, and you can see as I tighten the screw it's closing that gap. And I'll just tighten it down until there is an equal gap on both sides. Just like that. Now, I'm going to come to the other side of this scope cap here, and then the screw that is diagonal from the original screw I was tightening down. And I'm just going to snug that one up, just finger tight here. I'm using 2 fingers to make sure that the gap is equal. Alright, that's good. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the diagonal and the other diagonal. And then do the same thing on the front cap. Tighten it down until the gap is equal. And as I'm doing this, I'll just note this isn't the only way to mount a scope. You don't have to follow this exact procedure for it to be correct. There's a few different ways to do it. This is the way I prefer to do it. This is the way I've been doing it for years. I can't even tell you how many scopes I've mounted for customers over the years doing this method. Alright, so now all of these are snug. I cannot move the scope. Alright, so what I'll typically do here is just loosen one side here. Do the same thing on the front ring, opposite side, just loosen it slightly, just so that my scope rotates, okay? So now we can start leveling the scope to the receiver. At this point, I'll just double check how level this receiver is. And if you can't get in there with a level, if you can't get in there with a level, you can either use a smaller level or use a straight edge, something you know is perfectly flat. So I'm going to go grab that, and then we'll be right back with the actual leveling process of the Optic. Alright, so what I grabbed here, I have this Starrett level, and I know this level is perfectly flat on the machine surfaces. You can use a straight edge that you know to be perfectly flat for this exact purpose. Alright, so I'm just going to lay it on that rail and double check everything is still level. Which, while I was sliding this thing around and manipulating it, it did move a little bit. Alright, so it is level. Alright, so now we're going to need to level the actual Optic. And this is where things get a little bit tricky, because it also kind of depends on where you level it. Now, most people you see mounting scopes on the YouTubes, they'll just take a level, they'll throw it on that top turret, then they'll say, you know, the top turret's level, so level everything off of this. I can't tell you how many turrets I've seen that weren't level to the actual Optic. There's a lot of them out there, even on good quality optics. The reason is because this is on a screw, so there may be, and it's spring loaded, so there may be a little bit of torque on one side than the other. As far as where that spring's pushing, bases compared to where the screw it's on, right? So it could be tilted slightly left or slightly right. And that goes for pretty much any of them. And there's plenty of scopes out there that have the actual top adjustment that is slightly convex. So your level doesn't sit perfectly on it anyway. So you're wondering, okay, so if I can't level off the top turret, there's no other surfaces on this scope, how the heck do I level it? So there's 2 options. To get probably the most true would be using a plumb bob and using the reticle to actually level off of that. So a plumb bob, basically all you need is a weight and a string, and you just need to hang it on your wall. And that weight and string, because of gravity, will be perfectly level, because I mean the gravity doesn't lie, or at least it hasn't yet. Alright, so then you would just look through line up your vertical reticle to the vertical plumb bob on the wall, and then your scope's level. Another way to do it is if you're going to use a flat surface on the scope, I like to use the bottom. Pretty much every scope I can think of off the top of my head in this moment, I'm sure there's some out there, you'll correct me in the comments, but they have a flat machined on the bottom. You can use that bottom flat and that to the reticle 9.8 times out of 10, that will be true to the actual crosshairs in the scope. So we're just gonna hold our level on that bottom flat, rotate our scope, and level it that way. So if you were using a straight edge, I would push the straight edge against the bottom of the scope, set my level as close in as possible to the scope on that straight edge, and then level it looking at that bubble, doing it that way. But like I said before, I have a level that reaches far enough, and that looks pretty good. Alright, so now our scope is level to the rifle using the most true flat on the scope, which is the one on the bottom, in most cases. Alright, and then something I can also do here, what I like to do is I like to get behind the rifle, just kind of looking up that butt pad there, and just look at that reticle. Alright, now don't try to eyeball it and level everything by eyeball, because you're going to get it wrong if you just try to eyeball it in most cases. You get lucky, you know the old saying, even a blind hog finds an acorn sometimes. Okay, so what we're going to do at this point is move on to torquing those screws. So I'm going to get my torque wrench set up and we'll be right back. Alright, so I have my torque wrench set up here. If you're curious, I'm using the Fix-It sticks. They're field armor kit, so the kit with everything in it. And it has two different torque drivers here. One of them is for a higher rating, the other one's for a lower one. So we'll use this one on our cross bolts and this one on our ring tops. Alright, now throughout this process, every time you touch anything, it is perfectly acceptable to recheck your level, because it can and sometimes will change. So throughout the process, just keep double checking everything, make sure you're staying level. And at the end of this, I'll give you some examples as to why I think that is so important in the end product, because people will actually argue with this and say it's not that important. I'll give you my reasons why it is when we're done here. So the ring you're using may very well be different than mine. So I'm just gonna tighten this one to the manufacturer specs, and I would urge you to do the same. Pretty much anytime you buy rings, they should come with some instructions that tell you what to torque them to. If not, the manufacturer's website or anything like that should have information. We have a lot of that information on our website as well. So I'm just going to torque mine down. Alright, then onto the front one. Alright. Now we'll come to the ring tops. And I know I'm torquing the ring bases in this order. You can absolutely, as soon as you put them on and set the scope in them, it's perfectly acceptable to torque them at that point too. That's fine. We didn't really gain or lose anything by doing it at this point. I just wanted to kind of torque everything at the same time for the purpose of this video. Alright, so it looks like the rifle moved a little bit, but that's okay because that means the scope also moved. They're still level to each other. Alright, great. Okay, so remember we loosened these two at the beginning, and then we came across diagonal and loosened those two. So on the ones I loosened, that's where I want to start. I don't want to loosen these two and then jump over to this side and tighten them down there, because then my gap's going to be uneven. Alright, so now the torque setting for the tops of the rings will in almost every case be different than the bottom, so keep that in mind. And for a 648 screw, most manufacturers about 15 inch-pounds. Again, double check, make sure yours are that as well. And as I tighten down, I noticed this gap closing a little bit more. That's okay. We'll just come to the opposite side before we get to full torque, just to kind of keep that gap even. Actually loosen that just a hair, because I didn't go too tight on it. Alright, once you have those gaps close to even, torque it down. And that's still a little bit off, so I'll change that up slightly. And for the gaps, you can measure them, you can pull out a caliper. For these, I just eyeball them. You can get as close as you need to be. Honestly, this is mostly cosmetic anyway. So we just want it to look like it was done professionally. There we go. So I torqued that one, came across diagonal. Then I'm going to jump across to the other side. And then hit the diagonal again. Alright, 15 inch-pounds. Then I'm going to start back at square one, just double check everything. 15, 15, 15, and 15. Okay, the rear ring is done. Now we can jump over to the front one. But before I do that, again, I'm going to check my level here. And depending on which rings you use, some rings are worse than others, some scope finishes are worse than others for this, but as you torque them down, it can pull the scope one way or the other, so you'll just want to double check, make sure it's not doing that. If it is, typically I'll just kind of note how much it's moving and then compensate for that. And just to make sure, as you torque it down, everything is nice and level. Alright, so keeping these gaps even here. Alright, so now we'll start torquing. 15, diagonal, 15, come across, 15, and diagonal again, 15, and like I said, I'll just start at square one, double check everything. Diagonal, across, and easy enough. Alright, so now the scope is mounted. So of course, again, at the end, it should be no surprise, I want to check and make sure everything is still level. Alright, great. So the scope is now level. Everything's properly torqued. Okay, at this point, if you're using a bore sighter, you can certainly bore sight it. Typically what I like to do, bore sight it if I can, and then take it out 25 yards, get it on paper, adjust everything from there, and then take it out a lot further. So this one here, eventually we will be taking it out to our 500-yard range and doing a bit of shooting. Alright, so I told you I would mention before why I thought that the leveling is just so dang important. You'll see plenty of people out there, there's YouTube videos on this, they say put the shoulder up to your right, or put the rifle up to your shoulder, not put your shoulder up to the rifle. I mean, I guess technically you're still doing that, but words are hard. All right, so you'll just want to look through your optic. This is not what I recommend. They say mount the gun naturally, look through your optic, and level it like that so that it looks level to your eyeball, and then tighten everything down. And then with that, whenever you take your gun and rifle, they are obviously not level to each other. So the terrible thing with that is you have to make sure you're holding the gun exactly the same every single time, or else your windage and elevation are not a true windage and elevation, because they're no longer level. And the reason your windage and elevation aren't true anymore, so think of it like this, okay? Everything is perfectly level right now. So when I adjust this top turret, let's say I need to raise or lower my point of impact. Whenever I raise this, because my scope is not level to my gun, it's not going straight up and down. It's going up and at an angle. Okay, so let's say, for example, I'm shooting at a target. All right, there's an X or a circle ring on the target. My crosshair's on the target. My point of impact is here. All right, the bullseye is here. I want to raise my scope and come over to this point of impact. And what I need to do that is do my elevation, which should go up, and then windage, which should go over. If my scope's not level to the gun, when I do my elevation, it comes at an angle. Then when I do my windage, it goes at another angle. Then I have to chase my tail to get where that point of impact was. Which sounds terrible, because it is. Just level everything and you don't have to worry about that. Not only is it a pain for zeroing if it's not level, but you're only going to be technically zeroed at one distance when you do get it zeroed if your optic's not leveled. We did a whole Smithbuster on this for a more detailed description of that, even more detailed what I just gave. Go check out that video. It goes into the whys and hows and whatever of it. All right, so with that being said, properly mount, torque everything, level your optic to your firearm, and that's all there is to it. So if you have any questions or comments, or if you have another way of doing it, like I said before, there's plenty of ways to do this, and you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to post them down below. If you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button, and as well as that notification bell so you get notified when future videos come out, all that stuff. If you're watching this on the website, you need help with anything, or if you just want to hear our voice, feel free to give us a call on the tech line. We'll be happy to help you out. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.